Today at the National Press Club, the National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union and Senior National Vice President of the Labor Party, Tony Sheldon. He's a fierce advocate for worker freedoms and maintains the union movement has an important role in politics into the future. Tony Sheldon with today's National Press Club address.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank address. Well, no doubt much of the political public focus today will be on ICAC and the adventures, if you like, of the Liberal Party in New South Wales and its leadership. The union movement in Australia today also finds itself at a difficult and challenging time in history against the background of a royal commission into union corruption, the Labor Party in retreat, obviously politically, with calls for an end to the traditional link between Labor's political and industrial wing, calls by former, or outgoing, I should say, AWU Secretary Paul Howes for a fundamental shift in the industrial relations landscape in Australia, with a grand compact between unions, business and the government, and of course closer to home in terms of today's guest and the Transport Workers Union, Qantas, and the loss of thousands of jobs at the national carrier. To discuss his response to the current industrial environment, would you please welcome the National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union, Tony Sheldon.
Good. Thank you very much, Laurie, and good afternoon, friends, one and all. And of course, I'd like to say a special hello to my two children, which are with me, Liam and Lily. Well, I've come here today to talk about freedom. Who has it, who doesn't, and how we spread it to more people. Freedom is a subject that my side of politics has neglected for far too long. The term has been appropriated and actively redefined by our opponents. And this is profound. It's profound because it is the imposition of the conservative definition of freedom on the Australian economy, our society and our culture. For them, freedom is an abstract idea. It is about freeing the powerful from any sense of responsibility to other members of our community. Freedom to them is something to benefit corporate leaders and loudmouth bigots, but not the rest of us. I have a different view of freedom. I believe that to have meaning, freedom can't be merely formal, like the right to fly first class or aspire to be a member of the Chairman's Lounge. It has to be something people can actually exercise. It has to extend to everyone. A freedom that applies only to a fortunate few isn't freedom, it's a privilege. And I believe that extending freedom to everyone doesn't mean government getting out of the way. It sometimes means government empowering people by legislating for the common good. Freedom is something that is of direct importance to everyone. In many cases, it is of life and death importance. Let me give an example. The future of Qantas. The venerable old airline, we are told, must be cut free of all other considerations but those of other than those of corporate profit. Free from the requirement to be majority Australian owned for the purposes of national interest and security. Free from the obligation to connect Australians in far-flung parts of our geography. Free from any requirement to service its aircraft here in Australia, keeping planes safe and Australian engineers in jobs. Free from the requirement to obey labour laws that protect the Australian people from exploitation. And if you think I'm exaggerating, consider Qantas's employment of Thai flight attendants on domestic routes for as little as $247 a month. They're flying in our airspace, on our trade routes, breaking our laws. This is close to what Alan Joyce earns every 10 minutes. And consider what's happening to those who clean Qantas aircraft and handle its baggage. These used to be full-time jobs, with the sort of guaranteed hours of work, regularity of shifts and reliable fortnightly income. Things that enabled Australians to plan their lives, bring up children and prove to the bank manager they can repay a mortgage on a modest family home. Today, none of those jobs are full-time. Let me repeat that today, none of those jobs are offered full-time. Instead, Qantas has outsourced this work to dodgy contracting firms, some wholly owned by Qantas subsidiaries, and made this workforce totally part-time, with constantly changing rosters and sweated conditions. Aircraft cleaning crews have been cut from 8 to 5 to 3 people. Theirs is back-breaking, physically draining work. Injuries are up, stress is through the roof, but the pay is through the floor. You think I'm exaggerating? Well, you think about the use of cyber snooping, the new code of conduct. You think about these workers that are guaranteed $200 less a week on the minimum weekly wage in the case of these part-time employees. They have part-time pay but full-time bills. Friends, welcome to the casualisation of the national icon. Welcome to where the flying kangaroo meets the golden arches. Welcome to the modern Australian economy. To Qantas management, this sounds like freedom, but to the people employed under such conditions, it sounds like economic slavery. And of course, when you look at the freedoms the government entails, that they think the government use of cyber snooping and the new code of conduct being imposed on Commonwealth public servants, public criticism of government policy, even when made anonymously, is banned, and workmates are expected to dob in offenders to their managers. This isn't about the government opposing alternative views. It's about alternative views being silenced. Is this really the Australia we all grew up in? Recently, I've met lots of people on the receiving end of Qantas's idea of freedom. One of them is a lovely man. I won't give his name because I don't want to endanger his job. He's in his early 50s, a Qantas cabin cleaner. Until recently, he was looking forward to another 15 to 20 years of modest affluence, paying off his house, watching his children grow up, enjoying retirement with perhaps enough super for the occasional holiday. The freedom of retirement. Instead, thanks to the Qantas decision to outsource his job, make it part-time and halve his income, he's now free to live the rest of his life in quiet desperation, expecting any time now to be retrenched and given the freedom of unemployment. Free time on his hands. The last time I saw him, he was crying, and guys like that just don't cry easily. The English politician Lord George once said, "The precariousness of work leads to the servitude of the worker. The certainty of work means freedom." Lloyd George knew something about the realities of life our present-day business and political leaders also know but choose to ignore. Take senior management at Qantas. Last December, the day after Qantas' credit rating was lowered to junk status, and the company foreshadowed restructurings and mass sackings, its chairman headed off to the golf links for 36 holes, secure in the knowledge that his position and earnings wouldn't be affected. Another executive tweeted that he thought it was a good day for a late lion. Along with the subsequent announcement of 5,000 job losses, there was, of course, the pledge of a theoretical executive pay freeze. I say theoretical, because while we've been promised an executive remuneration freeze at Qantas for the last 4 years, executives at the airline have actually by 82%. Yep, you're right. 82% in 4 years. Mr Joyce last year earned $3.3 million, up from $2.28 million the previous year. More than 150 times what he pays his part-time cabin cleaners. The combined executive team earned $10.1 million, up from $6.8 million the previous year. 6 employees, more than $10 million. And so what did the last executive pay freeze yield? It yielded a pay rise in excess of $3 million for 6 executive employees. This is obscene, especially in a company losing money. In the face of this obscenity, I announced that my union would be considering civil disobedience to support the rights of forgotten employees and stop Qantas destroying their living standards. That's why I announced that I and other officials of the union will be willing to be arrested if that's what it takes. I'm prepared to give up my freedom if it can help our members achieve economic freedom. Let me tell the Qantas board, we are not bluffing. Just as they weren't bluffing when they closed down their own airline a few years ago. No notice, 110,000 passengers stranded and hundreds of unaccompanied children. We have a just cause and we are prepared to fight for it. When you free the people at the top from any moral and corporate responsibilities, you load everyone else up with the consequences. And of course, sometimes those consequences are devastating. Allow me to explain. As a speaker here at the National Press Club, I've extended the providing two guests. I thought long and hard about who I would invite. Perhaps a political leader I admire, or a television celebrity who would add public relations magic to my address, or a thoughtful economist. Those sorts of people used to get free lunch. Instead, I invited two Australians, two great Australians, whose fate symbolises what has gone wrong with our economy. Two women who in fact are quite extraordinary. The names are Listra Telefera and Lisa Sawyer, the wife and sister of David, who was killed when a truck drifted off the road and struck and killed him and another man called Albert De Beer in February 2011. Albert De Beer's wife, Suzanne, also wanted to be here today but couldn't make it. The man behind the wheel of that truck had been driving for more than 13 hours. He had most likely fallen asleep at the wheel when his vehicle left the road. Ever since the crash, these brave women have taken the fight directly to the management of companies like Coles, whose low pay rates and perverse incentives are the ultimate cause of tragic deaths like these. Free of the constraints imposed by safe rates, companies like Coles force drivers to work inhumane hours in poorly maintained vehicles to earn money to make ends meet. 40 hours become 50 hours, 50 hours become 60 hours, and sometimes 60 hours become 90, just to make ends meet. No 36 holes at the golf course, no Friday lie-in, just increased loads, delayed brake maintenance, more stress, more pressure, more risk, and tragically, more loss. Big companies like Coles call this increased productivity. I call it sweating. I also call it morally unconscionable and a crime that should lead to prosecution. The consequences of that is that Listra, Lisa and Suzanne are now free of loving husbands and a loving brother, and their children are free from having fathers to love them, watch over them, guide them to adulthood and give them a decent standard of living. For those left behind, this isn't a theoretical freedom that philosophers can debate, but a cruel, unrelenting, heartbreaking reality of life. With 330 Australians being killed each year in truck-related incidents, often the end results of sweated conditions imposed by penny-pinching major retail clients in particular, it's a heartbreaking reality that reaches into far too many Australian homes. One of my union members has told me recently how he has attended in the last few years no fewer than 52 truck drivers' funerals. That's right, 52. Someone's father, brother, grandfather, husband, neighbour, friend. This is what the relentless drive to bash up unions and deregulate every aspect of industrial relations means for everyday Australians. Tragedy. Tragedy at a mammoth proportion. And that's why we campaign so hard for regulatory oversight of road transport and its clients, to make such drivers have safe rates and are not forced to risk the lives of your families, your wives, husbands, children and friends as well as their own. Our victory in 2012 of setting up the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal to finally address this issue is now under threat. In November last year, Minister Erica Betts announced a review of the tribunal to be completed by 2019. We suspected the review was a formality the tribunal had already been made on purely ideological grounds. We were surprised in January when Parliamentary Secretary Josh Freud effectively announced the outcome of the review, that the RSRT would be abolished to cut red tape. This was before the review had even commenced, collected evidence or conducted hearings. When will we ever learn? Road safety is not red tape. It should not be about ideology. It should be about what is right. It is about lives. And surely the party of market forces, with all of its intimate knowledge of the impact of price signals and incentives, you would think they would get it right. We'll get that just incentives driving behaviour. In this context, they are driving Australians to the funeral parlours around this country. Friends, what we need in our country is a better sense of the public good, one that goes beyond the narrow ideas of productivity and managerialism, one that understands that insecurity, worry, stress and physical overwork are damaging our quality of life, unworthy of a modern economy, and a sign that something is fundamentally going wrong. We can do better than this. We can measure the consequences of the new free economy we are creating in other ways too, notably by the divides that are opening up in income and wealth in this country and across the world. This is not merely an obsession of unionists. The World Economic Forum now lists widening income disparities as the major cause of global tension. Archbishop Pell has said something similar, lamenting the decline of the middle class and the growth of economic extremes in Australia. Oxfam recently reported that the richest 85 individuals in the world have as much wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people. When Davos, when fund managers, the Catholic Church and charities alike are saying this, it isn't class warfare, but a lack of economic freedom. And whilst figures like those from Oxfam stagger me, they certainly don't surprise me. Given what I see in my own eyes going on in companies like Qantas and Coles, CEO and management remuneration up, family incomes down. What is happening at Qantas and Coles and other firms is a microcosm of a trend that's been going on for the last 30 years or so. It is the creation of a super salaried elite at the expense of everyone else, and the concentration of economic and political power in fewer and fewer hands. The costs of this inequality can be seen all around us. In high rates of youth unemployment, in unhealthy diets and obesity due to the lack of access to affordable fresh food, and the rising costs of education and the resulting unequal access to education, in a tax system full of loopholes and incentives only the wealthy can exploit. Friends, I believe in our society is reaching a crossroads. We are now seeing a massively irresponsible and undemocratic concentration of political and economic power, the likes of which we have not seen in Australia for generations. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman called it a new Gilded Age. Others call it the Downton Abbey Society, but I call it the Airport Society. Baggage handlers and airport cleaners on one side, the Chairman's Lounge members on the other. The battlers being squeezed harder every day, the lounge members getting everything handed to them freshly chilled on a silver platter. The little guys doing what they're told, the big guys telling everyone else what to do. The big guys getting more rights, and the people who serve them being stripped of their rights completely. We used to be a country where people felt empowered to stand up to the boss. Now, with just over 12% of the Australian 11.6 million workers on some form of temporary work visa, that part of our national character is being stripped away. We're told constantly there is no alternative to this, that market logic makes challenging this state of affairs impossible. Well, that is a lie. I'm here today to say that there is a better way than this ideology being imposed upon us by stealth in the false name of freedom. The people who run the Liberal Party not only know that, but they intend it, which is why they've set out to crush all opposition. For this is an assault on our freedoms, on our cultural inheritance, and on our right to have an elected voice in the workplace. As you know, the Royal Commission is underway into the union movement. It's quite obvious that this witch hunt, or for those of you who have read the Royal Commission practice note, this is a star chamber. It is specifically designed to embarrass the Labor Party and its new leader. But it's more than that. It's about crushing all opposition to the sort of society the Liberal parties want to impose on the rest of us. They will decide who works here and the circumstances in which they will work. That's what this Royal Commission is really about. They're going for broke. Enough crocodile to the coalition about the rights of rank-and-file union members. If anyone understands the real threat imposed by corruption in union ranks, it is the delegates, activists and organisers who devote their lives to workplace justice. They've all been ribbed at pubs and barbecues about credit cards and prostitutes. Their kids have been harassed at school. Their solidarity and activism on behalf of their workmates is now presented as craven acts of self-interest. They know all too well about why corruption can never be tolerated in our ranks, why every trade unionist has the collective responsibility to act against transgressions that bring our movement into disrepute. So if any investigation is successful in identifying corruption, we will applaud it. Just as we will applaud if any investigation exposes government members channelling public funds to the Liberal Party and trying to use influence to win state contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That includes bottles of Grange. But whatever the Royal Commission finds will not invalidate this critical, important role of unions in our modern economy and our modern society. The Australian people know this. They know unions are good for the balance of our society, even if they're not in a position to join a union themselves. The last time Auspol ran its State of the Union survey, 90% of Australians disagreed with the idea that Australia would be a better place without unions. And other studies by the Centre for Applied Social Research and Monash University have found that many more people would join unions if unions had more reach. These days, unions simply don't have the resources to recruit every potential member. So much for the claim that unions are too powerful and have too much influence over our economy. People who know what it's like to be powerless, at the mercy of management, want unions to be stronger. They don't want penalty rates abolished for retail workers and cafe and restaurant staff. When the leader of the SDA, Joe de Bruyn, recently fronted the Productivity Commission, he was actually asked to justify why Australia's retail workers are amongst the highest paid in the world. Most Australians think this isn't something to be justified, it's something to celebrate. The freedom to be successful. They think the idea of Australia as a fair wage economy that treats workers with respect is something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. Friends, if we're wondering why certain parts of the Australian community are turning against mainstream political parties in droves, it's because political parties no longer seem to articulate the concerns of everyday people. We can turn this around. It starts with the belief that in a democracy we do have the right to challenge the dominant interpretation of freedom and can make the economy work for everyone. and unions absolutely have a critical role in that. The last trade union leader to address this National Press Club called for a grand compact of unions, employers and government to address the Australian economic future. In the best of all possible worlds, that would be an ideal outcome, and I applaud his sentiment. Sadly, though, the government and much of the business community isn't up to this job of reconciliation just yet. There's just not enough ethical leadership, not enough give and take, no spirit of compromise and self-sacrifice, no sense of national community, no leadership, not enough care for fellow Australians who have to be part of the deal as well. I'm not just talking about union members and other employees. I'm talking about small retailers being crushed by giants like Coles. People on the land being driven into insolvency by ruinous farm gate pricing. Franchise operators being dictated to by franchising companies who want to mandate every single aspect of how they do business, from how little they pay their employees to how much tomato sauce they can put on their hamburgers. Men and women in their 50s thrown on the scrap heap of life by employers who won't give experience a go. Others fleeced of their retirement savings by excessive fees and charges and unfair superannuation returns. People on 457 visas being told they don't have the rights of other Australian workers, threatened with deportation, left at the mercy of bigots and unleashed by the planned repeal of the vital sections of the Racial Discrimination Act. Like Dung Nguyen, promised a job as a cook, but forced to do manual labour at $15 an hour to pay back debts of $30,000 for immigration agent fees, threatened with deportation and more debts if he's complained. Surely these people deserve freedom as well. So what I'm saying today is that before we have a grand compact, we need a grand realignment of our politics to bring unionists, employees, hard-ridden farmers, struggling small business people, migrants, the self-employed and the retired together to demand economic freedom. This is the sort of grand realignment Labor needs to hold and to lead. This is the opportunity for Labor to lead, to represent all those people whose freedom has been taken away, and do so proudly with a roar, not a whisper. Friends, the Australian people are worried about what's happening to their economy and society. They want us to make things. They want us to have our own airlines. They want fairness and they want economic freedom. They're worried about the lack of fairness in our community, about the disappearance of our manufacturing industries, about the prospect of losing important national icons like Qantas, and about the fate of those thrown on the scrap heap by an uncaring government. They're worried about the way we are now letting corporations make too many decisions without care for the consequences. And they're worried about their lack of freedom in an economy that increasingly gives freedom only to those with wealth and power. It's the job of the union movement to stand up and not to be intimidated into silence by a government that is out of control. I assure you, that is exactly what the transport workers will do. We will be loud and voice that freedom needs to be the voice that freedom needs to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony Sheldon. Time now for questions. Let me ask you the first one, and it's a double-barrel one in a sense. How do you see the industrial landscape playing out over the next 2 to 4 to 5 years? And in terms of whether you call it a grand compact or a grand realignment, of course, the point that Paul Howes, the National Secretary of the AWU, made when he delivered that speech here earlier this year was that Australia's prosperity is suffering. We're facing a jobs crisis and we're slipping down the totem pole, if you like, of international competitiveness. Now, if that is the case, and it seems to be, surely there must be some sectors of the business community. You've focused on businesses with, which you see as being negative in terms of their attitude towards the industrial relations environment and towards the union movement specifically. But surely there must be some businesses out there that share that same sentiment.
Look, I think...
Tony, if you could...
Look, I think there's, you're right, there is a great crossroads, and that is that we have businesses and leaders from a time when society was looking at bringing itself together. But we've also seen in the meantime, we've seen a decrease in the amount of rights of working people to speak up and speak out. We have a different economy from the 1980s. We have a different economy from the Accord. We do not have a situation where there is some degree of balance between the voice of working people with high unionisation, many collective agreements, an underpinning award system that reflected your value rather than how much you can be held down, and an employer movement that said we had to find a better way. Through the 90s and now, of course, the 2000s, we're now seeing a gross imbalance. So a grand compact isn't the right timing. A grand realignment is necessary. Businesses, in some cases, and I'd say in the transport industry, there are some very fine businesses. How do you compete with a corporation that says that we will give the lowest common denominator, the worst arrangements, the sweated trucks, the sweated employee contracts, without saying I'm responsible? When people are being killed and losing their lives, how can anyone say that those decent companies that are pursuing an ethical business model can survive? They can't. They won't. And the lowest common denominator is dominating in our sector, in our business and many other parts of the economy. When we see that 12% of the community, working community, are immigrant workers on visas that can be deported at any time, how do we have an economy that is fair? How do we have an economy that means your kids or you, when you are restructured, or as Tony Abbott would say, released from your present employment, as he said to so many of those manufacturing workers in the automobile industry, free to pursue what? Part-time jobs with full-time bills. There has to be a necessity for those companies and those corporations and those farmers and the business community and small business to stand together. I'm very proudly been elected as a National Secretary of a union that has close to 20,000 owner-operators, single-owner drivers, small business people that collectively bargain in agreements. We know what it means to represent small business. I would say we are the biggest small business organisation in this country, and I'd also say for all the other phonies out there, we're bigger than all of you put together. We know what small business wants. We know what they demand: fairness and economic freedom, the capacity to actually negotiate, not to be suppressed. And when you're an employee or a worker, you should have that same right. Your family and your family's family shouldn't be destitute to a part-time life with full-time bills and not being able to raise your family in any sort of decent economic freedom.
A question now from Patrick Lyon.
Patrick Lyon from the Daily Telegraph. If I could just ask two questions. Firstly, I was looking to get your reaction to Barry O'Farrell's resignation today, particularly in light of the debate we've had in recent years over the sad state of New South Wales Labor. Do you think the tide might be turning a bit and going towards the New South Wales Liberal Party? And secondly, I was hoping to get a reaction to the Abbott government's decision for badgeries this week, and also your comments on whether you support a curfew or not.
Well, you might want to repeat a couple of those if I've missed them. Certainly regarding Barry O'Farrell, and look, it's quite obvious that I'm going to say this. So he should have fallen on his sword. The question is, who are the others? It is implausible to hear the sorts of comments that have been made regarding when you see the notes that have been passed between him and his benefactor. But it raises a deeper question about politics, and raises the question about, here we've got a Prime Minister who said that Barry O'Farrell innocently, inadvertently misled. Well, I'll say this and very proudly stand here and say this. that I, amongst many others, wanted Eddie Obeid out of the Labor Party, and we did it. The question is, for all politics and all politicians, is not to find the excuses, but hold people to account. Look at the double standards. Turn around and make sure that we have a society and a community that's actually driving the same moral judgments, because they do have a moral and ethical responsibility. Now, regarding Badgerys Creek...
Just in terms of
yes,
turning the tide,
yes,
in relation to that question, is the tide turning?
Look, I think, it's, if the Labor Party relies solely on a 1959 range to say the tide has turned, then we are in desperate trouble. What we have to be arguing about is values. Will it be significant? It'll have an impact, absolutely. It actually exposes the Liberal Party for the hypocrisy which they attempt to push onto everybody else. But it has to be a lot more than that. It has to be about what are we leading and where are we leading it to. NDIS under the previous government, I'd say safe rates, which is very important, holding some of the most powerful businesses in this country responsible for truck drivers' deaths, which this government wants to repeal. Those sorts of initiatives are under a heading, and that is about values of society, how we value society. And we should be prepared to fight for it and say, rather than there's a battle about how we get the big end of town, the bankers and the others to agree with us, we should actually say about everybody else. How do we find a middle ground between the big end of town and everybody else? I say, no, we hold the big end of town accountable. We actually build a society that makes a difference. And in the case of New South Wales, those sorts of initiatives is what is going to make the difference. Express our values and go beyond a bottle of wine.
Badgerys Creek and the curfew specifically as well?
Well, Badgerys Creek, I've been a long supporter of Badgerys Creek. I had been previously a long-time resident of South West Sydney. High unemployment. I believe that the previous Shadow Minister, now Shadow Minister Anthony Albanese, should be given a great deal of credit for setting the environment against all the powers that were coming against him, to set the environment for Tony Abbott and Warren Truss to have made this announcement is appropriate, it's important, and I also congratulate Tony Abbott for that. It is appropriate. It is important for New South Wales. It's a gateway to not only the Sydney economy, but to the Australian economy. But I'll raise this question. What is Tony Abbott going to do about the quality of jobs? This isn't just about building some infrastructure and somebody making a heck of a lot of money and building another chairman's lounge. This is about the quality jobs that we're going to create out of it. Are they going to be part-time with full-time bills, or are they going to be quality jobs where we have career paths? Are we going to be replaced by 457 visa holders? I mean, the government has announced after case where 457 visa holders have been exploited, in their hundreds in the case of meat workers in central New South Wales. In the same month, they announced that any employer can bring in as many 457 visas they want once they get the initial intake. How's that an economy for the future? How's that when we're building a very important piece of infrastructure working for the entire community? It is not. They were tick for announcing it, a tick for driving on politics of interest to build up our economy, but an absolute cross about the advantages going to the entire community, because he hasn't answered that except with more depression.
And the question around a curfew?
And the curfew, look, that's really a question about what's practical in that geographical area. I have not been a supporter of a curfew out there. I'm certainly open to debate out there, but that's a matter for the politicians to make a considered decision on.
We'll take a question now from Andy Drummond.
Andrew Drummond from Australian Associated Press. Thanks for your time today, Mr Sheldon. Look, not long after last year's election, you described the Labor Party as a sick organisation. Since that time, have things changed? And is the party now better placed to come back into power, do you think?
Look, I think there's a combination of things here, and that is that there is a challenge about how the party does move forward. We, a sick organisation in this context, and that is that we have to be prepared to say to those that are gouging out of our communities and gouging out of societies that we should take them on. We should actually get them. If they're angry with us and they don't see that the rest of the community, they have a responsibility to the rest of the community, then we should take them on. And for those that have become allies, we should congratulate them for it. In case of the Labor Party, and particularly where we stand now, I think I have a great deal of confidence in Bill Shorten's leadership. Now, Bill does have, I grimace every time I see that attack made on Bill because he had the hide to be a trade union leader, elected by tens of thousands of people to represent their aspirations, and successfully built a union up that had been in bankruptcy and incapable of articulating its arguments on behalf of its workforce, its Australian community, its many tens of thousands of families, and built that up into a very coherent, engaged organisation, and then to become now the opposition leader, and hopefully one day Prime Minister. That's something to celebrate, somebody with that background. Compare that with many people after synodosis. I'll leave it there. I think it speaks for itself.
Amelia Brace.
Good afternoon, Amelia Brace from 7 News. You said this is an opportunity for Labor to lead, but in light of Louise Pratt's concession today, which points to factions once again overruling common sense, is it time for people like you, as someone in the hierarchy of both Labor and the unions, to step aside and let people in lower ranks with more progressive views take up leadership positions?
Well, ironically, I'm in the New South Wales right, and I'm proud of that. I'm third generation. But I also see that as being a responsibility about fighting for what's social justice in many respects. I don't think that's an archaic view, and I think it's held by many Australians. I think the comments regarding Western Australia, and I think I draw a parallel with South Australia. We had, in the case of South Australia, a very, very competent and successful minister, a very articulate person with the ticket there, and we managed to only win one seat. A very strong campaign run by my good friend Nick Xenophont. And then, of course, in Western Australia, we have the situation, what's occurred there. There is a deeper underlying capacity for the need for the party to articulate its arguments about what it stands for. It has to be able to say it deeper and wider. And, of course, failed candidates, regardless of their responsibilities in that situation, is a failure for the party not to win those positions. We do have a responsibility to make sure that we do reforms to the party that actually reflects the necessity to challenge the sorts of structures that we have at the moment. We should always be doing it. Every political party should do that. But that's not going to change the world. What's going to change the world is looking at the cultural shifts that we need to consistently argue for, the values argument, the reason why we're here, the reason why we want a bigger society, the reason why we want a better society, the reason why there should be a grand realignment.
Stephanie Ballard.
Stephanie Ballard from The Australian. Mr Sheldon. Hi. Could I ask you to elaborate on the campaign of civil disobedience in relation to Qantas? Have you fleshed that out any more in terms of what measures you'll take and also the timing, and whether we could see any of that impact on Easter at all?
Well, one thing I can guarantee here, and that is that both my members and said to me that I'm in consultation with many of them, and eventually there'll be a vote about this amongst our members as well, that we will not do what Alan Joyce and his board did. You will not wake up and find your family stranded somewhere in the world. You will not find your kids unaccompanied stranded somewhere in the world. But what we are prepared and what we are discussing amongst a broad cross-section of people in the community, and there are some things worth fighting for, and civil rights and economic freedom is one of them. And if that means taking acts to protect those civil rights and economic rights, because we have no other option, then we will. We've been saying to Alan Joyce and his board, along with many other unions, as representatives and the voice of 30,000 workers and many thousands of others that rely on Qantas for their employment, that we are prepared, the workforce is prepared to look at ways of cost-cutting, changing the operations in a successful way that means a lot for the workforce and the company. Other companies have done it in the aviation industry extremely successfully, and they have said absolutely no. We do not want a bar of it. It will not deflect one of those 5,000 jobs being lost and turned into part-time jobs. In negotiations with that same company, they have 1,600 employees that were told, you will never have a permanent job because we prefer to have, in the negotiations, looking at those employees face to face, those 50-year-old men and women, and said, we would prefer to have churn and burn in our business than have another permanent job. That is not the way to run an Australian business. It's not the way to run any business, and it's not the way that business should not be challenged on, and we're going to challenge it.
Malcolm Farr.
I'm Malcolm Farr from news.com.au. Mr Sheldon, you've got a unique vantage point from which to see how business is conducted in New South Wales, particularly in Sydney. Do you think it's any murkier in New South Wales than in other states? Are there different pressures and methods and practices in New South Wales than to other states?
Well, living in New South Wales and seeing a lot of the coverage over many years, and of course the various roles that I've had the opportunity to hold, that New South Wales is really a reflection on the rest of what's happening across the country. We have to actually, we've just had ICAC expose a Premier on whether it be a stumble or whether it be a calculated stumble. We have others to work that out. Why don't we have an ICAC in the National Forum? Why do we have Royal Commissions set up on the basis of insider political decisions? We had an announcement this morning that the great thing about the pink bats expose was that somebody's on the radio saying how when the pink bats were put into his roof, they smelt. And that was some sort of great expose on, and we're setting up a Royal Commission about smelly pink bats. I mean, how about we set up an ICAC inquiry that can look into the funding of political parties? Who gave the money to Joe Hockey's outfit that did the funding in his election? Who is behind the 500 Club? Who is behind the Millennium Foundation? And this should go to every political party, not just the Liberal Party. Every political party and every politician. Let's have a national ICAC, national accountability. When a Prime Minister can say that innocently and inadvertently this person misled, well, would that be right or wrong? He should be turning around saying we need to have a society and accountability that few politicians have. When Erica Betts and Tony Abbott turn up to the Royal Commission into the trade union movement, when they turn up, I don't think they're planning to, but when they turn up, and they should be required to turn up, they should expose and take the veil, lift the veil, using their words, of every company that has come and spoken to them and made allegations about corruption. They should lift the veil on every conversation they've had about corruption. Because I believe this decision to turn around and put this Royal Commission and spend $100 million is politically corrupt and inept. Because you'd be having a Royal Commission into all aspects of what's happening across the broader community. To have the Attorney-General in Queensland for spending 3 days talking about a building employer who wasn't given an enterprise agreement with the building union up there, couldn't get onto a building site as a result of that, then only to find out that the employer he'd been espousing for 3 days as an upstanding member of the community was actually the Vice President of the Banditos. This is a ethically corrupt system that we're creating, and we should actually have the capacity to delve through it rather than take the politics out of it and actually get the answers.
Matthew Knott. Oh, my apologies, Joanna Mather.
Joanna Mather from the Financial Review. Listen, I wondered, Tony, if you might talk a little bit about your take on reform in the selection of upper house candidates within the Labor Party, and whether you agree with Bill Shorten's proposals to dilute union power?
Well, I don't know whether I'd describe that as Bill Shorten's proposals. He hasn't announced them yet. But what he has said is about people not having to be members of a union. And that's in practice. There are many independent contractors and small business people that are members of the party that aren't required and have not historically been required to be members of the union. I think that change is a non-issue for me, but it's an important one in presenting to the broader community. What I think is important about the insiders' argument about pre-selections is this. We are the only political party that balances power. Now, two people that in my own group, my own faction of the union, own faction of the party, Chris Bowen and Jason Clare have said that they're supporters of having a changed system. There are about 5 people in their electorate that are community leaders that decide whether they are members of parliament or not, and ultimately the electorate. They get pre-selected by about 5 people who actually are leaders of their community within their community. Yes, there is 170 to 120 people that have a vote, but there are 5 community leaders that lead those votes. Not unethically, not inappropriately. None of them are elected to those positions, unlike union officials. We stand for election every 3 to 4 years. Elections run by the Electoral Commission. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. We are the one political party that has that balance between business, unions, community representatives, community voice. But we are the voice of 2 million people, elected to that voice. Those people, those 5 people, valuable community leaders, are unelected, but have a voice and they should be expressed within the party. You have to get the balance right. Regarding senatorial votes, I believe the present system, particularly in New South Wales, is appropriate and proper. You have to have people that are elected to the parliament of the party, which is their conferences, just like the parliament of this country, this great country, be able to make decisions. They're better informed, have a wider understanding of what's actually going on within the party. And I think that balanced with what we've been doing with community pre-selections, and I'd say this to all political parties. The National Party, I'm pleased to see, they followed it themselves in the seat of Windsor, with Tony Windsor's old seat, sorry. But to have community pre-selections. I think getting people more involved in the party political process and pre-selections is worthwhile. But in 2 or 3 or 4 rounds' time, we'll see whether we're Americanised, whereas big business, big interests come in and select and coordinate massive votes to be pre-selected to come in to actually have votes in various elections for party parliamentary leaders. You know, we at some point will be saying, is this still the right model? It is about how you get the model right. It should not be stagnant. It should be consistently reviewed, but it also should not be throwing out some of the strengths of this party, unlike any other party has.
Matthew Knott, question now.
Hi, Mr Sheldon. Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Before the WA Senate election, we obviously were very interested in the speech that Joe Bullock gave, in which he said some very interesting things about Labor Party members being mad and that he doesn't always vote for the Labor Party. Are they acceptable views for someone who's a Labor Party senator to have, and should he remain in his position there?
Well, first of all, I know you didn't ask this question, but I actually like making it clear. I'm actually a supporter of marriage equality, unlike Joe. But what I'd also say this, and that is that, you know, quite clearly there is a very broad church within the Labor Party. And for somebody who has said some rather provocative things at various times about some of our own political leaders within the Labor Party, and certainly many more about the Conservative side of politics, I wouldn't hang somebody for some words that might have been better off not said. But what is really underpinned in that Western Australian ballot is really this core argument and discussion. What are we actually arguing for? In the case of Joe Bullock, and the upside of the downside of the comments that he made, and there was a number of downsides, the upside is he has somebody who's given 30 years for fighting for some of the lowest paid workers in this country. He is one of those people the Productivity Commission is saying the height of you for bringing retail workers in amongst the best paid in the world. So, you know, we have to be looking at what we actually do back within the party, its values arguments, and also quite clearly about what are we actually supporting and fighting for. We are also a broad church, and we should continue to be a broad church, regardless of how much I might disagree with Joe Bullock.
Peter Phillips.
Mr Sheldon, Peter Phillips, one of the directors of the National Press Club. Welcome to the club. At the weekend, the Prime Minister returned to Australia from his visit to Asia, including to China. The Prime Minister, who of course is wants to be known as the Infrastructure Prime Minister, and one of the things which he has announced and which was discussed while he was in China was encouraging more Chinese investment in Australia, including investment by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Against that background, what's your view, and if it is a matter of record, what is the Transport Workers Union's view of the possibility of Chinese state-owned enterprise investment in key infrastructure such as, say, Sydney-Melbourne very fast rail, or even Badger's Creek Airport?
Well, I would say I'm not an expert on the whys and wherefores of the trade agreements that we're about to enter into, but I can say this very clearly, and that is that any arrangement that we enter into with any country, whether it be the Pacific Free Trade Agreement, free for who? Back to my previous argument, not free for people within countries like Vietnam and China, because it's not free. Workers' rights, representational rights are suppressed in those countries. People's voice is suppressed. The rich and powerful are getting richer and more powerful in those countries. It's not in question. And the question, of course, comes back to what are we doing about those sorts of arrangements in our trade agreements with China and other countries. We have got away, and the Labor Party has got away from arguing why we should have environmental standards, labour standards, requirements on those countries when they invested within our country. Requirements about, I'll go back to my pet issue, aviation industry. We allow companies like Qatar Airlines to fly on our trade agreements in our airspace, where if you're married, if you're pregnant, you're sacked. If you're gay, you're sacked. If you talk about a union, you are terminated. That's economic slavery. But they are allowed in our country, in our airspace. I believe we should have a values judgment about these agreements that we enter into. We should have a values judgment about what is in it for us as an Australian community. Back to the question about Badgerys Creek. We have to be not just looking about the infrastructure, but what is the quality of life that infrastructure brings. Both are valuable, but one shouldn't be undervalued.
Ken Randall.